Hello and welcome to our Voices in Montessori podcast. Dr. Montessori said, "An education capable of saving humanity is no small undertaking. So let's get to work." I'm Tamara Sheesley Balis, and in today's episode, we're talking about the de-emphasis of writing in many classrooms, why that's happening, and why it's important to keep writing and expressive skills as a fundamental, foundational part of student learning. And how do you do that in an authentic way in a Montessori Adolescent program? And I have to tell you, I'm so excited about this conversation. I was actually a writing major in college, and I really have to tell you, I think a tremendous part of my success as an educator has come out of writing skills, right? And being able to really do that. So I'm so delighted to have Corey Borgman with me today. Welcome, Corey. Corey is the Director of Education and Outreach for the University of Virginia's Montessori Science Program. There, she works alongside Dr. Angeline Lillard, and the focus of her work is to bridge academic research to concrete community impact. Prior to this role, Corey designed and led the early adolescent program at Mountaintop Montessori in Charlottesville, Virginia, where she was a teacher and administrator for 17 years. So lots and lots of experience. Corey's currently serving as the president of the Virginia Montessori Association and enjoys contributing to the Montessori movement through speaking engagements, consulting work, and advocacy efforts. She holds her doctorate in educational leadership from the University of Virginia and is the parent of 3 Montessori-educated daughters, ages 5, 10, and 12, which of course is a huge claim to fame, right? Welcome, Corey. Thank you so much for being here today.
So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
And one of the things I just discovered is that Corey, this is her first podcast.
It is.
Right? And so it's amazing to me to have people like you who are so incredibly capable, experienced, and we haven't gotten your voice out to the Montessori community, which is exactly why we're doing this, because people should not need to reinvent the wheel. They should be able to listen to somebody like you and have all those ideas and all that richness and not have to start from scratch so that we can build on each other's expertise. So I'm so grateful for you being here.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited for our conversation.
All right, so let's dig right in. What trends are you seeing in the mainstream educational context when it comes to writing skills?
Well, Tamara, I think in general, what we're seeing is a de-emphasis on writing, but that's particularly impacting creative and expressive writing. There's, in our standards and accountability-based context, there's a focus on a very narrow, often inauthentic definition of writing. That's a sort of expository writing, and also a narrow and formulaic definition of good writing, right? Because it needs to be easily translated to a testable context. So this test-driven context, there was a recent position paper out from the National Council of Teachers of English, for instance, and they described how this test-driven context is really narrowly defining writing as, in fact, composition, and that composition that children are being exposed to, or students are being exposed to, is really mirroring test preparation. So students are often quote unquote writing by actually implementing formulas or fleshing out a template, right? You plug it in, you have this kind of sentence follows this kind of sentence. And in this case, the product is being prioritized over the process. And we're valuing a very specific, narrowly defined written piece over the holistic development of a writer, which takes time and process, right? So I think that's how I would characterize my concern over the problem that I'm seeing in sort of a mainstream educational context.
It removes the thinking.
Right.
Removing the thinking.
And the expression and the identity.
Right. All those things have been taken out. All of a sudden, it's not what kind of writing do you really need to use in this situation. It's, okay, here's a formula, plug it in, and it removes so much of what writing is about.
Yes. And I think also, which we'll talk about a little bit later, I think it removes so much about what the adolescent is about. And that's and what writing is about to the adolescent, or could be or should be, right?
And I think there's an element of authenticity that the adolescent needs. Do you want to talk about that? Like, when you take away their voice, what happens to the motivation?
Right. So I think the problem is twofold, right? So that students are moving on to higher education or the work world or the real world in general, lacking the true preparation to communicate authentically. With a real audience and from their own cultural and personal perspective. There's no formula or template that teaches you how to express yourself from your unique perspective and to a real human audience, right? So I think that's the first problem, is that this is not preparation for the kind of writing and the kind of oral communication or written communication that people are going to need to be prepared to do in the real world. And then I think the second part of the problem is that I would argue that students and adolescent students in particular, they disengage from this type of writing. They fail to develop their identity as an author or a writer when the process is formulaic and inauthentic, right? So we know that the development of a mathematical identity is important to progress in math, that the identity, like science identity, is important to progress and application of science to one's life. And the same is true for writing, that it's identity of oneself as an author that leads one to continue to produce writing and therefore to progress in that skill.
And has you want to dig into it with teeth. I mean, really, like, and I have a daughter who's in the adolescent community right now, and she is in the throes of writing a novel. And, came home last night. She's like, Mom, I'm at 33,000 words.
Amazing.
Right. And it's come out of that model that you're talking about, because her guide is, like you, deeply committed that those students have that experience of owning their own writing, and it's their voice and their expression, and it's not formulaic. Not that you don't need to be able to write. I mean, they actually are talking about the 5-paragraph essay and what the value is of that.
Essential skill. It's an essential skill.
You have to have that. And how many other, it's not a plug and play. It's not a plug and play. Right. So, okay. So talk about the factors that are contributing to this trend of having our adolescents be so hamstrung, and really not just adolescents. Let's be clear. Yes. This is coming up all the way through the levels. Why are we here?
Yeah. So again, I think, my interpretation or my understanding is I see two primary factors feeding into this de-emphasis of writing, or the removal of authentic writing from the curriculum. The first is that, as we see sort of time and time again, that many expectations and practices in the traditional educational approach are built on this foundational assumption of traditional teacher-centered instruction, right? So educators' conception of what's possible in their environments can be somewhat constrained by their estimation of what they can be feasibly responsible for, right? For what can they deliver to their students in this time block that they have. So reading, deep engagement with the written word and reading, responding to writing, and editing, these are time-intensive endeavors. And so one is literally just logistical and feasible. Like, if I have 60 plus English language arts students coming through my classroom in the course of the day, I can't read 60 5-paragraph essays by the time I see them on Thursday or, next week. So I think that's a real constraint, and it needs to, and again, it's based on this foundation of that the learning comes from the teacher, right? But the second problem, I think, is that in our context, and 40 years into this sort of standards and accountability based movement, writing is a subject that is not easily measured and tested, right? Especially not if we're talking about authentic writing from a child's unique perspective. You can more easily measure the formula. Does it match the rubric? Does it meet this formula, right? So the rational response on the part of schools and teachers is to allot less time and emphasis to writing because it's not going to be tested. It's not going to be tested, or if it is, that very narrow definition of writing is what's going to be tested. So significant pressure is exerted externally on educators to boost scores in reading and math. And we know that a common response to that pressure is to narrow the curriculum, right? And to ensure that instruction matches testing. So I think the two things are this, the two major, certainly not the whole problem, but part of the problem that I really see is this demand on teacher time in a teacher-centered environment, and then the accountability context that if this aspect of this is what's going to be measured, then that aspect of it is what I have time to teach.
And that's fair. I mean, you can understand.
It's rational. It's the only rational response to the context. Right?
That's exactly right. And so until that context changes, we can't ask people to, it's a big lift to ask people to step outside of that framework. And how do you can't address that within the current frame. Right.
Correct.
So, and we love teachers, right? We want teachers to have the ability to use their intelligence and their capability and support a program that actually allows for full self-expression for our adolescents and our young people. And until the model shifts, conventional model shifts, there's no access.
Right.
So, okay. So let's talk about Montessori and what Montessori can bring to this conversation. So in your mind, does the Montessori tradition and community have any way to contribute to the larger conversation around this challenge?
Yeah, I believe that we do. I think we have some, unique and special aspects of our classroom context that allow us some opportunities to look at this in a different way. So for starters, we all know that as Montessorians, we're called to look for the child, right? Look to the child. And in this case, we're talking about, not necessarily a child, but a young adult, an early adolescent. So many Montessori schools exist within the public sector and face those same contextual challenges that we were just talking about. But we must resist the pressure, right, to structure our environments and our curricula primarily around the needs of adults or the district or the data or around current employment trends, right? What do they need to know about writing to land a STEM job, right? And instead, we need to respond. We know as Montessorians to respond to the needs and characteristics of the young person that's actually in front of us, right? So if you've ever worked with adolescents, it sounds like you are currently working with at least one adolescent at home. You know that authenticity is everything to adolescents, right? Self-exploration and the ability and the opportunities for self-expression are everything. And so our presentations as educators, our presentations of the role of writing and the writing process and the forms and genres of writing, they must be just that, right? They must be authentic, expressive, culturally relevant, and originating from the child and their own experiences. And they must prioritize the developmental process over the written product. And so that, I think, is the most important thing we have to contribute as Montessorians, is that children will become writers if we create a context in which they can develop the identity, an author identity, right? Instead of concentrating on what products they're outputting.
And okay, so can I ask, what does that look like when you are in a Montessori classroom?
Yeah, well, so writing should never be contained just to the time that you're dedicating to English language arts instruction. Because a child may really already self-identify, for instance, as a scientist. They may really think of themselves as a scientist and therefore not be focusing on their development of author identity. But if we talk about how many ways that English language arts skills are actually embedded in the work of being a quality scientist, then we can capitalize on that, right? And making sure that those opportunities, even across the curriculum, are not only expository, but also creative. And that they take a lot of forms, like, that yes, you have to learn that 5-paragraph essay. That's the basis for all sort of structured thought, right? Any kind of speech is going to rely on that 5-paragraph form. But even in science and history, there are creative opportunities. Can a child make a graphic novel demonstrating their knowledge here? Can they write a poem? We're going to go a little more in depth on that in a future line of questioning here. So I'll leave that off here.
Okay, great. Okay, so those are key values, right? We're following the child or the adolescent, right? And not call them children. That does not work.
Do not.
And we're emphasizing process over product, which I'd also like to circle back to once we dig in a little bit more, because I think oftentimes in Montessori, it's easy to then not support students in understanding what polished work also looks like. So we'll circle back to that, but I do agree completely. We've got to focus on process and in creating an environment that allows for the child's self-construction, their full ownership, the adolescent's full ownership of their own self-construction. So how do Montessori guides honor those values when it comes to writing?
Yeah, well, so in that first question there, we kind of addressed teacher affect, or teacher sort of philosophical approach of turning to the child. And, even in a traditional context, teachers can have that affect, but there are some structures that are constraining their ability to implement that philosophy fully, right? And we're very lucky as Montessorians to have some sort of physical and temporal structures that we work within that are conducive to us implementing that child-centered philosophy, right? When it comes to writing. So let's talk about those. So one of those is our sort of turning away of simple letter grading structures and our reliance on detailed, informative, and qualitative feedback and assessment rather than letter grades. That's a stronghold, right? So, of course, I would argue that approach to feedback and approach to assessment is important across the entire curriculum. But in particular, a child's writing is a place where you cannot simply slap a percentage or a letter grade on the top of the page and expect growth and development to take place. Okay, so I got a C on this piece of writing. Now what? It's not as simple as it was an incorrect answer. The correct answer was C. Right. So you need instead to really dig into a child's writing and be able to have conversations with them, whether written or orally, about what's working and what's not, and to help scaffold their growth process. And that needs to happen as an iterative process, that certain pieces may need to go through multiple cycles of response and revision and editing. That is not typically how grades and tests of writing work in more traditional environments. So our familiarity with processes of rich and ongoing feedback is perhaps our first advantage, right? So a second advantage, I think, is our comfort with broad student choice, right? So when students write about topics they're interested in, things they know a lot about or that they want to know a lot about, then they blossom as authors. And I'm going to tell you sort of a memorable experience I had from my classroom that I think really illustrates that. It sticks in my memory, at least. So at my school, which you said was Mountaintop in Charlottesville, we had a long-standing tradition of graduating 8th graders delivering speeches to the entire community at our year-end ceremony. We call it a rising up ceremony, right? And as you might imagine, the process of supporting students through the creation of those speeches was, without fail, a long and difficult and often dramatic, emotional one. There was a lot of, anxiety or resistance or perfectionism often would get in the way. Like, I know I want this to really nail this, and I can't get down a word, right? Mm-hmm. So inevitably there would be one or two graduates that would just experience terrible writer's block, and they couldn't overcome it until a day or two before the ceremony, despite the fact that we had started this process literally months in advance, right?
Oh my gosh. And that had to add to your stress.
Yeah, it was a lot, and there'd maybe be 10 of these. So one year, it was these 3 boys, right, that were experiencing this writer's block. And these were brilliant, creative young men, right? Each one of them. And they happened to be best friends. It was a group of 3 best friends, right? But however brilliant and clever and creative they were, nothing was working for them when it came to this speech. Like, nothing that I tried. I tried connecting them to other writing mentors. So maybe it's just me and I'm their writing teacher, and they're done with me after 3 years with me. And so I'll connect them maybe to another man in the school community, like another teacher who shares a male identity with them and could coach. Maybe they'll open up to him. I tried that. Mm-hmm. I tried brainstorming with them, thinking through their memories and things that I remembered had been particularly engaging or memorable to them during their years in middle school. Nothing that I tried.
Not working.
Nothing that I tried was moving them towards success with this speech, right? And I think it may have literally been the day before graduation. There was not a single word on a page for any of the 3 of them. And in some sort of conversation of trying to get to the bottom of this, or just trying to figure out how to get them to have something that they would feel happy with the next day, it kind of came out that they were constrained by what they had seen before of these speeches, right? So they're making these assumptions, like these are, one person stands up and gives a speech, and it's usually very emotional or it's very impactful, and sometimes there's tears involved, and they thank their mom, and they knew that just wasn't working. What they had seen before wasn't working for them. That wasn't going to be their voice, right? Mm-hmm. So finally we hit on, let's just put the 3 of them in a room. Yeah. and really make it clear to them, this is theirs. Like, just because they had seen that wasn't the assignment, right? Mm-hmm. That's what they had seen. That's what how other people had chosen to approach this assignment, but it wasn't what it needed. They had free reign to make this theirs, right? We had to really communicate to them. And honestly, within hours, a couple of hours, they came out. And they were clearly very excited and very proud with whatever it was that they had come up with in that room. Mm-hmm. And I will tell you that this speech was one of the funniest, most memorable 8th grade speeches in my 17 years of teaching. They decided to work together. They gave the speech together, all 3 of them. Mm-hmm. And it sort of took this form of a roast of me and my co-teacher. And in this roast, I had this persona. I was this mad Frankensteinish character who was always coming up with sort of like harebrained and dangerous ideas. And my co-teacher, Britt, was like this hunched over, Igor-ish yes man to my Frankenstein, right? Shout out to Britt, by the way. She is a brilliant and wonderful and empathetic teacher, not at all an Igor-ish sidekick. But people talked about that speech for years. It was well written. It had great comic timing. It was polished both in its writing and its delivery. I mean, within a day, they were acting. It wasn't just read; they were acting it out. And what it really came down to was creating a space for the students to feel that the piece that they were writing, even though it had a deadline and it had some basic expectation, it was theirs. and their voice and perspective would be what was heard. That they were reacting to that idea of plugging their end of mountaintop thoughts into some sort of a formula, like, oh, I had a challenge and I persisted and I overcame it, and then here's what I learned or how I grew as a person. That's not what they wanted to do or wanted to talk about. So that was a really long story, but to illustrate the idea that student autonomy and choice is crucial in their identity as a writer. What they made felt very loving to me, right? It felt very loving and very expressive, but it was hilarious, and I was absolutely the target of the, of the humor. But I couldn't have asked, I just thought it was this brilliant, like, oh, I thought I had turned it over to them, but they don't fully realize that it was turned over to them. How can I make a context in which they understand, oh, you want to do it three together? Sure. And then after that, it changed because other people saw a different example of that. And we had times that people wrote a song after that and performed it on guitar. And it started really taking a much more unique and authentic, started becoming a more unique and authentic opportunity for student writing.
Oh, how beautiful. How beautiful. I love that story. And also, I just have to underscore the humility that you had to bring as a guide. And Dr. Montessori tells us, our egos have to stay at the door when we walk into the classroom. There's no room for it. And you really modeled that for them, that it was okay to poke fun at you and also that it didn't have to look the way that it looked, right? What a great gift for their lifetime to be able to think outside the box.
Right. So who's going to end up being an author is the person who looks at writing and thinks, well, I can write, but I don't want it to look the way like everything else I've seen, right? That's an author. Right. That's what an author does.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, for sure. Okay. So, and I think you wanted to also, I think, talk a little bit about peer learning and peer feedback.
Yeah, I did. So another advantage in the sort of Montessori framework. So I'm not talking about individual teacher skills, right? I'm talking about frameworks for classrooms that allow those individual teacher skills to shine, right? So the third Montessori advantage, I think, is our orientation towards, peer learning and peer feedback. And these are leverage points of ours that significantly can, if properly leveraged, significantly ease the demands on teacher time that are required to read, respond, and edit student writing, right? They also offer this bonus benefit, which is that students improve their own language skills through the process of reading and responding to and editing the work of their peers. So when they identify something that was really powerful or something that worked, or they give a pointer for how it could be improved, those are skills they take back to their own writing, right? So I hear from my colleagues that work in more traditional environments that a major roadblock to really doing writing in their classrooms is that it's completely infeasible due to the time and effort required to even read, let alone authentically engage with and respond to student writing. Again, that example of a teacher who just teaches language arts and they have 3 to 5 blocks of 20 to 30 kids coming through, and that you can't do that, right? And so, we may or they may want children to have the capacity to write substantial creative and expository pieces, but that's not feasible in that context, okay? But there's an alternative, and that alternative is to teach early in the year as a foundational language arts skills what it means to read and respond effectively to another person's writing, right? So in my classroom, we would discuss the traits of effective writing. We would look for examples of effective writing and see, why does this work or why does it not? And then we had some tools that would scaffold students' response and edited, some rubrics that they would help develop to help them scaffold the process. So some peer feedback was given in writing, some was given verbally during weekly authors chair readings. And again, we would really define that process, and we would hold each other accountable to when we veered off of the process of effectively responding. And we practice those skills. We practice the skills, again, not just in language arts, but all across the curriculum. They could practice those, you know, in a history paper or a Spanish paper. And in fact, that process was so important that students even received feedback on the quality of their feedback, right? So part of the qualitative assessment throughout the year would relate to how thoroughly and helpful they could be in supporting the improvement of their peers' writing. They got responses to their responses. So I, of course, as their teacher, also, you know, I continue to write, to read, and to provide feedback on my students' writing. But typically, it would only come to me after it had undergone several processes of several rounds of feedback from peers. They could seek out another teacher in the school. They could ask their parents or an older sibling. And once it had gone through 2 of 3 of those, they would know, like, I'm really ready for Corey to look at that. So our students in that classroom were able to produce a lot of written work, just a high volume of written work, and also to select a small subset of pieces over the course of the year to fully polish and integrate into their writing portfolios. But meanwhile, the time demand and the workload remained fairly manageable and sustainable on my part.
I will share with you that part of what I'm hearing is also there's work to be done for young people to know how to offer feedback. And separately, just even from the writing component and the support of you as a teacher not being completely overwhelmed, they need to know how to give critical feedback. And one of the things that I find as a school administrator is I get folks coming in who have not ever received critical feedback from really anyone. Like we were in some ways culturally protecting young people so much that they haven't taken hard feedback before, and they haven't had anybody look with a critical eye. It's, you know, good job, you showed up, good job. And that does not work. And then then what I see often happen is that there's this support of them in a way where they're not having to take real feedback. They're not having to do that big thinking. And then all of a sudden they go to college, and how do they do when they're getting that real feedback? I actually had to call a young lady in and we talked about it. She said, you know, I have heard good job since I was a kid. And you are the first person not saying, hey, good job, you showed up on time. Right? Like all of a sudden we're saying that's actually an expectation.
Right. It's not a goal.
That's basic standard. And she said it was really hard for her to transition from that. And she never learned how to give people feedback. So it's a thing that we work on with our whole staff on how we give critical feedback. So I just want to underscore that a piece of that is also so beautiful and so important in so many other ways.
Yeah, that's actually something I didn't highlight, as that part of that early year training. I was really highlighting the giving, but we also talked about receiving stance, you know, so we talked about open heart, and that this is about making your writing better. We made sure that feedback always started with what was successful about the piece. So we always started there, but then it was a scaffolded process where it wasn't that people just were spontaneously throwing you criticisms, but after we hear what's working with our piece, we're going to hear about some ways that we think it can be improved. And then there was a rule, no, like explaining no justification and no defensive justification of your writing during that process, right? So there would often be like, oh yeah, I was going to do that, but I decided to do this, right? And that's a way of defending yourself from hearing it. And it was really beautiful to see the process over the course of a year or two of somebody really being afraid of that critical process, or defensive against it or resistant to it, to becoming a writer who was like, you guys failed me in my response because you didn't give me anything to improve, right? So
Yes.
we would really saw that when they were saying like, this was a really, low ball response. You told me good job, but nowhere here is there something that I can go back to my writing and improve at. So we knew we had a success there when people were actually demanding harsher, more critical, like dig at.
Talk about building lifelong learners.
Hopefully,
right?
yeah.
They're so deeply invested. They're like, hey, you're not giving me enough here. How, that's beautiful. How beautiful. What a beautiful framework for really what school should be, right? It is that we're coming and we're saying, hey, I want to learn. Hey, give me the feedback. Hey, help me improve, right? So they're so invested. Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
Right.
Beautiful. Okay. And then you wanted to also, I think, talk a little bit about reading and writing skills across the curriculum.
Yeah. So I want to say like the final sort of structure, right, that we have in our classrooms that lends itself well to this work is that we are used to an very highly integrated cross-disciplinary approach, right? And so that work of engagement with text and writing is easy to do when our teachers are more generalists. So a given teacher might see a child not only in English language arts, but also in humanities or science. We're very familiar with the work of our colleagues, and we're working already to integrate that. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So when we see that embedding of English language arts across the curriculum, we see that students' engagement with both content areas is enriched, right? So this might take the form of a student writing a poem about their family's genealogy or cultural traditions in history or in humanities. Or again, like these are examples I mentioned earlier, they might write a graphic novel illustrating scientific concepts that they've been learning about. They might write a research paper about a country in foreign language class, right? So options like this are avenues for not only for demonstrating or sharing knowledge, like a sort of third period lesson, right? I'm demonstrating that I know about this historical or scientific concept, but it also allows students to find themselves and their voice within content that can sometimes feel externally dictated, right? So that embedding, it has enriched their writing, but it's also enriched the content that sometimes can feel like a standard of learning, but now they're finding themselves in their ways to write about it. So it helps them to discover new forms that writing might take, or new subjects that it might grapple with that they hadn't considered before. It helps them see a whole array of options for the development of their identity as a writer. And as we've said several times before in this podcast, when we're working with adolescents, that identity development, we know that that's key.
And that allows them to be so much more deeply connected into what they're doing. And that is the motivation. That's how we as human beings become motivated, is through that connection with what we're doing, that meaningful connection to our own self-construction and our own work. And what we know is when students are disengaged, they're just trying to check the boxes off. They're not building the skill nearly in the same way. And it's harder. Right. I completely appreciate that this is an outside the box model for so many folks. And this is what we do in Montessori. This is foundational to who we are as a Montessori school. Thank you. I have to tell you that everything you're saying, I want every Montessori adolescent community to have this information. Everyone, and not have to, because my guess is you had to figure this out as you went. Right?
It took time.
Right? I mean,
but I did come from, similarly to you, in undergrad, I was a language arts with a writing concentration major and a sociology major. So it definitely came, there was some personal investment in understanding what writing was and how important it was in sort of all aspects of life that I brought to the work, but how to make it work within this structure, the confines of a classroom. Yeah, that took some time.
And there are folks who don't have that foundation. They're coming in with maybe an education background, or they could be coming in with a math background or the history, and not always having that foundation in writing. And so for them, that's the goal, right? Is to have everyone be able to stand on each other's shoulders and grow together. And so I love that. Okay, so talk about your conference workshop. We're so excited about it. And I know that embedding reading and writing skills across the interdisciplinary, say that 3 times fast, curriculum is the topic. You want to talk a little bit about what you're going to work through and
Absolutely.
Into?
Absolutely, yes. So today on the podcast, we've talked a lot about the what and the why of the issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is lacking in traditional approaches, and why that might be taking place, and some of the key leverage points of the Montessori approach that provide us with opportunities to do writing more often, more thoroughly, and more authentically. But at our workshop this summer, we're going to get more concrete, right? We're going to dive into the how. What can we do in our classrooms to encourage authentic and skilled engagement with the written word across the entire curriculum? So to my mind, the skills that are involved in reading comprehension and interpretation, as well as those required to craft a tightly organized or successfully expressive piece of writing, those are skills that transfer to nearly all aspects of the curriculum, right? Mm-hmm. Students need a broad vocabulary. They need thought mapping skills. They need to understand how to employ supportive evidence, for instance, in order to take part in a civics debate. Or they need to clearly articulate an original thinking process and how to incorporate visuals in order to communicate mathematical solutions. So believe it or not, we're going to have English language arts mathematical integration activity in our workshop this summer. So those, of course, are just a couple of examples, right? But when we embed reading and writing skills across an interdisciplinary curriculum, students' engagement with both subjects is enriched, and we're going to talk about that. So many times during my classroom career, I heard parents and students express that the Montessori approaches, the emphasis on writing skills, was a crucial benefit and advantage that they saw because mainstream educational approaches were de-emphasizing writing because of the lack of its presence in testing, right? So in short, I want to use the opportunity of this workshop to encourage Montessori programs to move in the opposite direction, right? Adolescence is a time for young people to try out different identities and different ideas, to learn to express and articulate those through the written and spoken word, right? Our programs, our Montessori programs can and should foster that developmental phase through rich and rigorous interdisciplinary approach.
This was so great. And for listeners at home, we invite you to subscribe to our podcast to hear the latest episodes and to join our conversation on Facebook and Instagram. On our website, you can see the show notes from today's episode, and we have included a link to Corey's dot profile, where is it dot? Is that right?
It is. I don't want to give an ad for it, but it's a little technology that when I hold my phone up, then your phone gets all the websites, all the things that connect to me. But then also you can just go to the URL. So I shared the URL there, so people click, and then they'll see the Early Development Lab at UVA and the Montessori Science Program website and my LinkedIn profile, and it just kind of compiles all the stuff in one place.
I love, that's amazing. That's amazing. We need to send all of that out to folks who are registered for our newsletter too, if you don't mind. I mean,
sure.
If that sounds, because everyone needs these resources, right? And there's no reason to be digging. So let's get all of that onto our resources page of our website, and let's get it out there to the world. Let's get it out there to the world. Okay. And listeners, thank you for spending your time with us today. We know your time is precious. You're doing the important work. This work is so important for our world and for humanity. And we're here to help. in this Montessori revolution. Join us next time.